Welcome back, my friends. Before we get into this fabulous interview with Dr. Rachel Ross, I wanted to just remind everyone that next week I'm doing a free live webinar where I'm teaching Level Up Your Workouts, how to add in plyometrics. And this is for the midlife person or anyone over 50 like me who strives to feel athletic in their body and you're not sure how to integrate plyometrics and agility. And I'll be talking about that Tuesday, February 18th, 7 p.m. Eastern. And the sign up details will be in the show notes. So let's talk about who is my guest today. Dr. Rachel Ross is a neuroscientist and physician at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where she leads groundbreaking research on the brain's role in stress, metabolism, and eating behaviors. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me, Tina. Can I come to the plyometrics lesson too?
Yes, absolutely. It's for all those
Amazing.
ladies who want to add that in. But I want you to kind of share with us a little bit more so that everyone understands where you're coming from, and especially for us non-science people. What do you do in your research?
Yeah. Okay. So my research, we work with mouse models in my lab, where I have grad students, I have postdocs, I have medical trainees, as well. Uh, and we work on the neural circuitry involved in metabolism. Stop me at any point if you want me to say more about the things.
Okay.
Um, And what we do is we try to understand the way that signals from the body, which are commonly hormones, but can also be nutrients, get to the brain, and how from within the brain, those signals are passed to other parts of the brain to coordinate the body's response. And we're really interested in how these signals get changed by certain parameters in the environment, by stressors, by potentially changes in diet. Isn't something we're working on right now, but it's something I find interesting.
Yep.
And how these systems can also be upset in the setting of illness, or how people's standard normal way of being allows them to be susceptible to the things that we might consider to be illness, like anorexia or overweight and overeating associated with obesity.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Can you give me maybe using a real life example with one, either a food, whatever it is, so that so we can understand how it might apply in everyday life?
Ooh, I think that's one of the issues with science. Study when because we're trying to understand how the brain works, right? We're trying to
Hmm.
understand how the brain works and how it communicates with the body. And so it's a little removed from everyday life, but the way that I think of it as connecting, and it's outside of disease, is really like, let's say I smell somebody baking cookies. I really like a chocolate chip cookie. It's like a thing. Also popcorn, we can go salty or sweet here. But let's say you smell that input is a cue. And in general, for me anyway, that cue is associated with like, I want that thing. Like,
Hmm.
I need that cookie right now. And the systems in my brain are going to process that cue and process it along a motivated pathway that's going to turn on other pathways or check with other pathways or other information that's coming from the body, so that my whole self can say, okay, cookie time, or actually, just kidding. You literally just finished eating a cookie. You probably don't need another one. That smell isn't that big a deal. So it's really sort of processing information inputs and then coordinating the response, which is something we do all the time.
Without thinking, it's just going on in our body. And
Yeah.
essentially, you're studying that whole process of what goes, just the pathways and what triggers.
Yeah,
Oh,
we're
that's so
studying
fascinating.
the pathways, the connections between cells, but also the messengers that send the information that crosses from one cell to the next, or from one cell to a whole area, because it turns out the messengers have different ways of transporting themselves across different regions.
It's so fascinating because right now I'm studying a precision nutrition course and
Hmm.
just covered digestion. And I think in studying what you're saying, like what signals are a cell telling maybe a group of organs whatever what to do, that the body's so complex. It's kind of incredible. Like, could it, even a person have invented, something so
Yeah.
complex like this?
No, absolutely not. Like there's literally no way. But then the other thing that's really cool within that is if you look at different organisms, there's different ways of doing these things. Sometimes they're conserved, right? So
Hmm.
mice also smell food and decide to go for it. So we can study these things in those model systems. But other animals don't have that same, like, they don't have the same senses that they're sensitive to,
Hmm.
or they have different processes. And it's quite amazing to just think about, I guess, from an evolutionary perspective, how these things got like tested out and what stuck and then what became the next complex organism or how it moved up in levels.
Yeah, it is incredible. Let's go into the questions
Yeah.
now that we're thinking about that. Let's go first into the topic of stress and eating. So, how does stress impact our eating behaviors, and why do some people overeat? Or when someone's stressed out, some people just don't even think about eating.
Oh yeah. This is such a good question. I have two thoughts about this. One is going to be related to biology or the like genetics, and one is going to be related to like learning, nurture experience. Um, I think, and both of them probably play a role. So, starting with the biology, um, eating and maintaining your body weight are like incredibly important, but there's like that's one side of the important coin of like surviving in life, and the
Hmm.
other part is um how you expend energy, right? So like when you're lifting, that's like energy expenditure, but there's also standard basal things like producing heat, moving yourself around, your body storing or releasing fat, which you have no conscious control over, or efficiently using your muscles. And all of these things are encoded in genes. Additionally, all of these things are influenced by stress. And so if you think about the stress response, another like colloquial term for it is the fight or flight or freeze response.
Hmm.
And that's like, what you do when you're presented with a tiger. You need to have access to your energy to either get away fast if you're going to fly away or like take the flight, or you need energy to like fight in response, or you're going to reduce energy and have that freeze response. And so different things are going to happen based on your body's tendency to respond. And again, in the freeze response, you might be conserving energy. So if you were in an alternative context of life stress, you might have a reduced drive to be eating, and you might also have a reduced drive to output any energy. So you'd kind of shut down and you wouldn't be feeding yourself.
Oh, that's
Whereas,
interesting. So that's part of
yeah,
the freezing, like how some animals, what is it? What reptile is that in
sloths do
Florida? Was it?
this.
They just stop moving. They just
Yeah,
pretend they're dead. Okay.
yeah, exactly. And it works for them because
Hmm.
other animals can't get to them, and they just, it's like fine, except for eagles. Apparently, sloths are a natural predator. Eagles are natural predators for sloths. That's not a thing I study.
Yeah.
Um, but so that is, like depending on what your genes push you toward, what's more available to you, that
Interesting.
response is going to potentially affect you. And in a non-stress state, the balance might be a little bit more conscious. Like you might be
Yep.
thoughtful, like, I'm a little bit stressed. I want to eat popcorn right now, me. But maybe I can tolerate it. But then in a more
Uh-huh.
stressed state, it might be less possible to do that. And also in a more stressed state, you might actually shift the balance based on what your body's has access to. But then I'll
Yeah.
also add there's a learned element to this, right?
Hmm.
Which is how you as a human soothe yourself, or how you got soothed by others, especially when you were younger, when your brain's developing, which is kind of setting up the neural pathways that
Hmm.
become almost like a habit as we grow up. So if you learned as a kid that like if you're crying and you're sad and you're upset, somebody gives you a bottle and that makes you feel better, you might associate that like eating food makes you feel better when you are upset, no matter what the upset is. Or if
Yeah.
you learn to associate that like getting food as a reward it like is a literal reward when you do something good, you might see that as a way to combat the bad feelings for yourself, right? As you get older.
Yeah.
So there's ways in which we've kind of taught ourselves that eating when I don't feel good can help. And on the flip side, not eating when I don't feel good can help. And that
Mhm.
usually is a learned behavior.
That's interesting. I was thinking that we might even create our own learned behavior, especially I was thinking when women, we grow up dieting a lot. So that means restricting, like, oh, you can't eat that.
Yeah.
And then going off diet, having that reward, it
Yeah.
just becomes this forbidden thing. You
Yeah.
want it. And then it becomes a soothing thing because you're not allowed to have it. And then
Yeah.
it's a treat.
It's a cycle of sort of tricking yourself.
Hmm.
And it also hits on the gene pathways thing too, because
Hmm.
if you are stressed by not having the food that you want, that's going to
Mm.
push in a direction as well toward potentially trying to fill that need or fill that or like overcome that stress. And again, some people have a greater capacity to be in a starved state, right? And not pay attention to it, not be upset by it, have the capacity to pay attention to other things. And I think that there's something about the metabolism there. There's something about that genetic capacity
Hmm.
that is meaningful, that allows for the restriction, which may or may not be, something that's sustainable for the entirety of life. But lots of biology underlying all of this.
In some ways, that's very, what's the word? A little relieving to know that that's not because we lack willpower or because we lack whatever, that there's always our genes that present or that kind of determine things, even though we have control to some extent. This is a little off topic from what I originally was going to ask, but
So it
the
goes.
since you're also a psychiatrist, does
Yeah.
having that kind of information, knowing that, maybe knowing how our learned behavior was, is that helpful in
Ooh.
changing behavior?
Yes. I mean, I think you have to have an awareness to be able to target change, right?
Hmm.
You can't really grow. Like, I'm thinking of a flower. I'm like, in my head, I see a flower. If you, except for an orchid that can like literally grow from anywhere in the air, or an air plant, you really do need to like settle in the ground and then grow from there, right? And
Yeah.
I think ground is kind of like, where am I starting? This is
Yeah.
not a metaphor I've ever used before, so I apologize if it didn't work. But like, you need to see what you're targeting to be able to change it. So you need to notice whenever you do it to be able
Hmm.
to undo it, right? And that
Right.
actually gets into sort of the biology as far as we understand brain circuits involved in cognitive behavior therapy and using awareness and using
Mm.
really things that come from a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is this like in humans it's huge, in lower level order animals it's less huge, but that's where we integrate the inputs, whether they're sensory or internal or somebody talking to you.
Uh-huh.
um, and that also has the capacity to sort of block inputs from other parts of the brain. And that capacity, that's sort of how we perceive, it's what we understand as willpower, right? And
Hmm.
you need to make use of that to be able to overcome the inputs that are saying, do this habit, do this thing, respond in this way, the way that you know how to respond, or the learned way that you know how to respond.
Mm. Oh, I like that. And let's talk about the brain and cravings.
Mm,
Can you explain how the brain regulates cravings? So this is kind of moving on from the similar questions. Regulates cravings and food choices.
hmm hmm
And then are there strategies to teach our brains to make healthy choices?
Yeah. So I think the way the brain actually the way the brain is doing things is pretty much exactly or in line with what I just was talking about for the
Hmm.
way that the brain responds to the inputs. It creates sort of a habit loop. And again, it's a
Hmm.
learned habit loop. So it's something that you may have a natural preference, right? As a
Yeah.
kid, I was a kid who loved lima beans. Weird. No one likes lima beans, but for some reason I like really, really love them. And that was just a natural preference. And I apparently would crave and ask for lima beans. obviously also cookies, but let's go with lima beans because that's different.
Yep.
Um, and so, lima beans, they're not programmed in my brain as a particular thing. There's no cell for lima beans. There's no molecule for lima beans, but there are receptors on my tongue and in my
Mhm.
nose that are going to respond to lima beans in a particular way, to the texture, to the smell, to the taste, to the chemicals that are in it. And at a particular time in my life, that was all I wanted. So the brain is processing those inputs, and the brain, as I'm young and in this open state to trying out all these new things, it's saying, this is what I want. This is what I want over, say, broccoli, which is not true anymore. Now I'm a broccoli person. But my brain is sort of processing that and saying, okay, when given this option, always go right. Because it's
Uh-huh.
easier, it's less energy for my brain to have to think through every time and make a conscious decision every time. So
Uh-huh.
then that gives us the trick for getting back to how do we deal with cravings. So if we
Yep.
recognize a craving is like a habit loop in the brain, right? And I'll give a very concrete example. When I walk into my room, my bedroom, I always I go with my hand to where the switch is and I flip it up on the right. I don't do the same thing with my left hand. I automatically do that. I do not think about it. It is not it's an automatic process.
Yeah.
A craving is kind of like that. It is an automatic process in response to either something that I'm doing or feeling or
Mhm.
seeing around me in the world. So if we become conscious of that
Mhm.
automatic process, like when I move to a different room, not my bedroom, where the light switch is on the other side, I may have to think or I may have to notice um, what has changed in the context around me so I can train myself to a new habit loop. So I think ways to do that
Mhm.
are really like we started talking about being very, very, very aware,
Mhm.
recognizing what are the inputs that are consistently associated with the craving that you have. Are there consistent things that you can notice? Is it 3 p.m. on a workday when you are bored at the office? Is
Uh,
it
mhm.
every time you get an email from a particular friend? Whatever
Yeah.
the things are, there's usually stuff going around that acts as a cue. And
Mm.
what you can start to do is come up with replacements for responding to that cue once you notice you have a cue. So, for example,
Yeah.
if there's something that you don't want to do anymore, right? Let's say you have a tendency to, when you come home from work, um, want something crunchy. And oftentimes that crunchy thing is, let's say, potato chips. I love crunchy. And you find if you open a bag of potato chips, then you eat the whole bag of potato chips. And then that feels bad at the end of
Yep.
the bag of potato chips. So you want to step it back, right? And start paying attention to, huh, what is it I actually need in this moment? Is there something? Am I hungry actually? Do I want something that I know I enjoy? Am I unhappy for whatever reason? Do I need to change my context, whatever it is? And then the next thing to look at, and I would, for what it's worth, I'm a big proponent of writing this stuff down
Mhm.
uh, because doing it in your head is kind of like the habit loop is happening at the same time as you're going through the process. And it's really hard to have them like work with each other.
Interesting. Yeah.
So putting it outside of your head, like
Mhm.
talking to a friend, talking to a therapist, talking to a piece of paper, an audio recording, whatever it is, externalizing it from your head is really, really, really helpful. Because we can kind of be our own worst enemies when we're trying to make change to ourselves. And
Yeah.
you're not doing anything wrong, right? Like there's actually nothing wrong with eating potato chips when you get home at the end of the day. Like it's fantastic if you love it. If you don't feel good when you're done eating those potato chips, that's where we start to come into a problem. If you're noticing that, like, actually, my body hates potato chips, my teeth start to hurt after I eat too many potato chips because in my aging, they're a little too crunchy for these teeth that
Uh-huh.
I have, whatever it is. And so you really do have to pay attention to yourself and think about what might fit the things you came up with, right? If you're feeling bad about your day, would it be helpful to talk to a friend? Not a potato chip. If you are feeling like is starving because you didn't eat all day on a particular day, would it be helpful to have a more easily accessed food item, either a bag of potato chips that's more in line with the size and amount that you want to eat so that you're not sick afterwards or you're not in pain
Hmm.
afterwards, or something else that you've decided you prefer, you would feel better about eating after you eat it. I want to just mention something that I think I'm hinting at right now, which is that we commonly sort of binarize foods as
Hmm.
bad. And that is something that I think is also really important to relax. I think it's really, really important that like there's literally nothing wrong with potato chips in moderation.
Yep.
Everyone, did you enjoy potato chips, should be able to enjoy potato chips. And so again, finding ways to moderate that if what you're finding, and I'm thinking towards binge eating right now, if what you're
Hmm.
finding, if you're overeating these things that are made to be craved because they hit so many elements that people tend to crave, what could you do to bring that to something that feels a little bit less out of control, and a little bit more in line with what you want for yourself? Um, and yeah, I think just the last thing, like talking to a friend or having a friend who's in this journey with you, has some like shared experience that you can kind of do together,
Yeah.
helps. If you're trying to change behavior, having accountability outside of yourself is generally really, really helpful. And there's lots of ways to get that either through friends or through
Mhm.
programs, through coaches. I think, we do this a lot with so many parts of our life. Um, and it's not a bad thing to do consciously when you are thinking about trying to change your engagement and your behavior around food.
That everything you're saying is so interesting. I can hear the psychiatrist in you because
Yeah.
even um, with the idea of like we think that thinking about stuff is helpful, but that point of externalizing it, writing it in a journal, talking to someone about it, and how that actually is much more effective for our brain is a very notable suggestion that you're saying. And then it's funny, like you like I love hearing it from someone who's a neuroscientist
Yeah.
and doctor saying
Yeah.
that that's
Well, I
very
would go
important.
so far. I even tell my patients, like, use a pen or pencil and paper because typing, I mean, it may depend on age, and I am of an age where computers weren't part of my early life,
Hmm.
but I feel a lot more connected to writing by hand. I
Yes.
feel like I can experience, like my emotions will flow by hand better than they do typing. Other people, I've made this recommendation, for people who didn't grow up with writing, who are of a younger generation,
Hmm.
audio recording is a way to externalize without bothering. The thing is, I do recommend having that audio recording, like transcribe so that you may or may not want to look at it, but it is helpful sometimes to look at and then to
Yeah.
burn or erase, whatever your preference is. But it's really, um I don't know, I have the experience, especially for really smart people who
Hmm.
like to intellectualize. They hear a thing and then they pass it on to someone else. They don't do it themselves, right? And there is this, like, if you have to take the time to do it. Um, and the way to do that is to, like, actually sit down and do it. If you do it in your head, you're fighting yourself. You're still in your head, and we're always nicer to our friends than we are to ourselves. I guess that was my example. Like, we
Yeah,
pass it on because we know it's helpful and we want to help our friends. But
that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that you said, which also was interesting about nutrition, is what I hear all the time, like even in the precision nutrition coaching course, is the idea of being more like how we should be in life more mindful. So if you're
Mhm.
eating or choosing to eat something, to slow it down and be mindful of the emotions as you're choosing that thing or as you're doing it, instead of just eating the thing because you feel like you want it and not noting, being
Yes.
aware of the why, and that even that it's a habit loop.
Yeah. I mean, I think our culture this is not necessarily related to food, but I think of it as related to food. We spend so little time paying attention to what we do with our
Mhm,
time. And my example for this is brushing our teeth. We do it twice a day
mhm.
if we follow our dentist instructions. And I it is a rare person who pays attention to brushing their teeth while brushing their teeth. But it is such an amazing mindfulness opportunity. Um, and I, as an idea, just to, this is something, again, I also recommend to my patients. So for the world out there, here's a thing you can do. If you have difficulty with mindfulness, because it's hard to pay attention to yourself, because it's so much easier to not pay attention to yourself. Try paying attention to brushing your teeth while you brush your teeth. It's a 1 to 2 minute life experience of mindfulness. And what you do in that moment or 2 moments is you recognize all of the sensory experiences that you're having. Toothpaste, because we're so lucky in this country to have toothpaste of a particular type, it smells really strong. There's a massive smell. It feels grainy and then it changes into this foamy situation
Yeah.
and you feel it on your teeth and you taste it. That mintiness comes through in a flavor and you hear it, whether you're using like a vibrating mechanical toothbrush or you're just doing the thing with your hands. You hear all of that. And of course, you are generally in a bathroom with a mirror in front of you, so you can see it too. So all of your senses are available, plus the alternative senses that we don't think of as the top five. Like, where am I standing in space? And how am I feeling the space around me, the air behind me, or the floor beneath me? There's
Right.
so many elements to what you can pay attention to that, in general, I find if I do this, it makes me laugh. Like, I find it silly. It's like a fun thing because it kind of takes you back to being a kid when you were first learning how to do this. Your parents used to have to do it for you, but then we get bubblegum flavored toothpaste and look, it tastes so good. Don't you
Uh-huh.
love doing this? Right? So
Yep.
I find that, like, for people who have difficulty, especially if they're having difficulty with eating and eating behaviors, starting the mindfulness with something other than food
Mm,
is a step into that, because food can be really uncomfortable. Again, food
yeah.
is incredibly triggering. Cues around food, social judgments around food, around the way people eat.
Yeah.
It's hard. So yes, for your precision nutrition class, and there's a starter tactic for 1 minute mindfulness that anybody can do, assuming they have teeth, um, to
I
just
like
to
that better than because even the idea of people trying to meditate, that's a lot harder for people to even for 1 minute, but
yeah.
being mindful of your brushing teeth is
There's so many
probably
things to pay attention to if you
yeah,
start paying attention.
I love that. And let's move on to something I think a lot of my listeners think about is hormonal shifts in weight. For women in their 40s
Mm,
plus
mhm.
experiencing hormonal shifts, how are there changes that affect the brain's relationship with food or food and stress?
Yes. I love this question as a person in my 40s experiencing hormonal shifts, which are like, we don't talk about these things. So
Hmm.
thank you for asking. And it's known in the research world. It's not exceptionally well studied in the research world, but these circuits that I mentioned that we study in my lab that are involved in eating behavior as well as in metabolism are responsive to sex hormones. And that actually, it makes sense at baseline because these are circuits that are important. Um, well, actually, let's think about this. Puberty for males and females,
Hmm.
and at later stages of life, your metabolism and your body changes so much.
Hmm.
And the sex hormones are what drive those changes because those are what are changing at that time. And the sex hormones interact with the hormones related to metabolism at these circuits. And so they're very important, which we see with the body changes at puberty. And they're equally important for the body changes that happen at other life stages. So for perimenopause, That means that you, post puberty, have gotten used to your body, your metabolism, your eating cravings, your way your brain works in every single way has
Mhm.
gotten used to this fluctuating level of estrogen and progesterone, and even a particular fluctuating level of testosterone.
Mhm.
And at perimenopause, those fluctuations start to become more fluctuant, which is to say they change more. They are
Mhm.
dynamic in a way that becomes less predictable. Much of
I
the
like the
period,
way you described that. Yes. Uh-huh.
yeah. So we get used to the predictability, and that predictability, the up and down, is regulating things in a particular way. And
Yep.
when the predictability changes, the regulation also changes, and it's less predictable. And it's confusing as a female who has these hormone shifts over 10 years on average
Mhm.
to be like, do I trust this body? What is happening right now? Why
Yeah.
is it so tired? Or I am ravenous right now. Why am I ravenous? I did nothing yesterday or today, whatever it is.
Yep.
These are shifts that are occurring in response to your body's sort of natural petering out of that regular cycle. And
Mhm.
that regular cycle has brain responsive elements and body responsive elements. So it's happening across the body. And I'm talking about sex hormones right now, but stress hormones also manipulate these metabolic circuits directly and indirectly. And they probably manipulate the way that the circuits respond to the sex hormones and the way
Yep.
that sex hormones are changing. So, we have like these multiple levels of complexity, which is why I can't give you a direct, like, this is how we're going to
Yeah.
fix the world and everything that's up with people. But we need to understand at those different levels how these hormones are affecting each other, how these hormones are individually affecting these particular circuits with their multiple actions of outcome, and then how, when you take one away, what happens, or
Mhm.
how, when you kind of bring one down a little bit and bring the other one up a little bit, what happens? Or let both come down, what happens? So there's multiple different changes that we're going to need to get into to understand what it is to expect, what it is to be a female or any person going through these hormone changes, because males also experience a decline and a change to some degree in their sex hormone experience,
Yeah.
which doesn't have a name because it's not quite as drastic, because it's not quite as regularly changing. So,
Uh-huh.
and I'll add one more thing. There's interpersonal variability. Every human, based on their genes, has a different starter level response, different need for the predictability of the cycle, and a different,
Yep.
like, even length of cycle, right? Um, so there is almost no normal,
Yeah.
except for to say that anything and everything can be normal in this experience, which is hard.
Well, what I heard, which actually makes sense, is because it's not just about, for women, progesterone and estrogen, and because there's other things that other hormones they affect and other multiple
Mhm.
complex actions going on in our body, that the weight gain that a lot of people experience, even though I think research studies have say, oh, our metabolism doesn't change, but with
Yeah,
all these other changes, yes, it is going to be
yeah,
affecting
and
how we retain weight.
it's where you retain weight also.
Mhm.
So the estrogen, the action of estrogen through the metabolic circuits, whether they're neural or body, actually tells the body, like, put the fat in these areas where it's accessible in a particular way to what I need when I need it, which is like, breast and hips and thighs and whatnot, which
Mhm.
is specifically useful for, let's say, you become a pregnant person.
Mhm.
um, and then once the estrogen cycling and the progesterone cycling kind of peters down to a lower level, when you stop having the bigger shifts in estrogen, what happens is your body fat goes to different places. So what you notice, it may not be a big weight change, but a weight shift where you're
Yes.
carrying weight and
Mhm.
how you are using and when you are using and what sources of energy are offering your muscles the weight that you want to, or sorry, the nutrients that you need to use to do the things that you need to do with your body. And so what happens over time is that the female body loses its like estrogenic shape,
Uh-huh.
um, and becomes more likely to carry weight in certain areas. It's also, you can potentially like gain more muscle mass because you have less of those female hormones putting your affecting the way that your muscles um, are aligned with each other or are being shaped.
Uh-huh.
So hormones are participating at like every point. And there are people who study this in mice,
Yep.
and there are people who study this in humans.
Yeah.
And I think the metabolism doesn't change when you're older. Paper. Um, I think that the way that they measured metabolism, I think doesn't get at these slightly more microenvironment level changes.
Yep.
So whole picture metabolism may not change. It doesn't slow down, but
Yep.
it shifts the way it gets put into place. And as your body changes, that also sort of shifts the way that you're using energy.
That makes total sense to me. I can see that. I know you might not have an answer to this.
Mm.
Um, it makes me think about how what women are being told, or like you know, in the whole the menoverse, is that in order to combat these weight gain, it's still activities that's always good for our health. That lifting weights, doing certain levels of cardio.
Yeah.
Uh, so is it just that in doing the things that we should always do, even though some women have been continually have been doing that, but they notice their body changes, um, how do those activities change the way
Ooh.
you know what I'm saying?
I
Like our
do. I think I
body.
know what you're asking. Like,
Yeah.
if you do particular type of exercise, how
Mhm.
does that shift the way that your body like stores or regulates its energy?
Yes.
You're asking?
That's
Yeah.
exactly what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
So yeah, you need to have an exercise physiologist on,
Okay.
because I know some things about that, but not necessarily in a research space. Things that
Okay.
I know are cardiovascular exercise in the female prior to menopause. It it helps with the fat partitioning that is feminine in its way, in its body shape.
Mhm.
Uh, and as you over age 30, actually, females should do more muscle building exercise because that's necessary for maintaining bone health as estrogen starts to wane, because estrogen is really important in bone solidity structure and in the
Mhm.
way that we make use of certain nutrients that are stored in bone. On the flip side, males who historically tend to do more of the muscle building should be doing more cardio as they age, because that actually helps. I think it affects some of the energy partitioning and the way males have estrogen, right? Because testosterone gets made into estrogen. And so cardiovascular exercise, I believe, affects the fat storage in a way that maintains the hormone at a testosterone space as opposed to going and converting into estrogen, which can happen with more fat being available. So as you age, males should be doing more cardio and females should be
Interesting.
doing more weight bearing and weight loading. And that's more of like medical knowledge as opposed to like science based research knowledge. But I
I
know
like that. That's a nice summary.
I know that there are people who know more about this than I do
Yeah,
because
that
it's
was
a people question.
yeah, I'm sorry. That was like kind of just an impromptu question
Yeah,
that
that's
came
fine.
in, but uh, this I've been interested in because I think a lot of women have, in some degree or another, had issues with eating. So I'm
Mm,
curious when it comes to eating disorders, um, what the legacy of an eating disorder. So maybe when you
yeah.
were younger,
Yeah.
you might have been bulimic or anorexic. What kind of legacy does that have on the brain and body?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great question. So part one of that is the habit loops and the learned behavior, which they're, you know, like I said, the brain will create the loop. It becomes kind of like a rut. You get stuck in it and you can get yourself out of it, but that connection doesn't entirely go away for most people.
Okay.
Um, and so it's kind of always available to jump back into, especially in times of stress, because it's usually being used as a way to manage particular feelings in response
Yeah.
to stress, whether it's anxiety or depression or what have you. So that's the brain part of it.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the body part of it is, especially with something like bulimia, or where people are actively vomiting, you can do quite a lot of damage to certain parts of the body. And things that sometimes don't get better are if you have vomited such that you've affected the stomach lining and the esophageal lining. You can end up with problems with swallowing, and or with potential cancer in those parts of your body later on, because they after a certain point, it's harder to regenerate the
Hmm.
cells that are needed to line that part of your body.
Hmm.
And then it's also the case that people who tend to vomit end up having tooth issues that aren't necessarily fixable over time,
Yeah.
and salivary issues that those are manageable.
Yeah.
But you have sort of like a science and medicine word, hypertrophy, overgrowth of um, the processes that help support the continual vomiting,
Hmm.
that
I see.
can be problematic. And then on the restriction side of things, um, the body, there's some elements of the GI system
Hmm.
that may or may not, depending on how long the restriction was lasting for,
Yep.
it can lead to forever sort of like slowing of the movement of nutrients through the gut, because the body responds to the
Oh,
fact
by
that the
hanging
first.
on to things.
Exactly. So slowing it
Hmm.
down. And that for some people that never recovers, and that leads to constipation problems and feeling of being overfull very quickly.
Yeah.
Those things can also, they can recover, and they can be related to the gut nervous system, or they cannot. And it depends on the person. And then I had another one more, for overeating. So people who have a binge eating disorder that becomes associated with overweight body, um, the fat cells that you grow to store fat, they like to live forever. And they can, as you lose weight, they become flattened, but they hang out and they're still there.
Hmm.
And the fat cells that you have, in order to hold more fat, and this is actually a very like positive thing, it makes you very efficient, they become bigger, and the size may stay and the number may stay. So you lose the weight, but you have your body, parts are still available for storing more energy should it be necessary. And
Hmm.
say the skin that's encasing that, and the fascia encasing that, especially if you're young when you're engaging in this and having an overweight body type, you are growing, more skin to cover more fat. And when the fat goes away, the skin may not.
Hmm.
And so there are things that can, the fat cells stay, the fat inside them goes away, and
Yeah.
therefore the parts kind of stay. And so those are things that can last, and still be around even with recovery. And I think it's to every individual to sort
Yeah.
of have know how to manage those things, to work with generally their physicians to think through how best to manage those things. Those, for what it's worth, those body parts, I don't think of as being sort of stressors in the same way to always make it possible to go back to the behavior. So to my mind, they're health and aesthetic related, but they're not necessarily a risk for future engaging in eating disordered behavior, or disordered
Yeah.
eating behavior. Whereas the fact that one has used this coping skill or a particular way of engaging with food as a coping skill, that um, the longer time you have away from it, the easier it is to ignore it as an option, as a
Hmm.
tool for managing.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Uh,
I feel
and
like that wasn't a happy response.
no, but I think the next question will be is like a what can we do about it? So
Yeah.
in terms of, I feel like eating disorders, it really, like you said, it's whether it's a stress or emotional management.
Yeah.
What are some simple science-backed ways to manage stress or prevent stress-induced eating or uneating
Yeah.
habits?
Yeah. We're going to go right back into psychiatry mode with this.
Perfect.
So, I think the things that we talked about before, making it conscious and then making sure that you, the person, is in your best tip top shape to manage any stress around you, and the environment around you is in the best tip top shape to be able to help you manage that. And everybody, for everyone, that looks different. I'm a cluttery person and I love the clutter and it makes me feel good, which is like not other people. But for the individual, it's like the very basic things that you will hear from everyone, and you don't need to be a doctor. Sleeping, having regular sleep and getting enough sleep for you, which is really hard when like things are keeping you up at night. Um, Exercising, whatever exercise means to you. It can literally be getting up from your chair once an hour or once every half hour. It can be going for a walk, points for going for a walk with a friend, because then we hit another thing, which is being social. But
Mhm.
anything exercising, anything moving your body, anything where you aren't just sitting and sentient and sedentary is really important. And I think it is a helpful stressor for your body to exercise. And
Mhm.
so I would recommend, as I'm saying, anything goes. But if you can push a little bit to find yourself a little out of breath or find that your muscles are working a little bit, that is it's a body training mechanism, because it is a body stressor in the purest sense of the world. It's changing the things that are happening in your body, and your body has to respond to that in a flexible manner. And the more opportunities you give it to be flexible, to respond to a stressor that isn't like an urgent, terrifying emergency, then the more capacity it will have when those urgent, terrifying emergencies come through.
That
I
makes
think,
sense.
yeah, thanks. There is science to that too, actually. But I think I would add a couple more things, which
Mhm.
are just, we talked a little bit about meditation. It doesn't need to be sitting and paying attention to your breath. It can be literally anything that you can give yourself the opportunity to focus on for a period of time, to attend to for a period of time, and notice when your attention is wandering. So you have the luxury of bringing your attention back. And that is the practice of meditation. Bringing your attention back is part of being conscious and aware of what you do when you're doing things that are not what you want to do. So that's the reason for thinking about meditation as part of this toolkit. And
Mhm.
then being in community, getting it outside of your head, having other people show you they're not judging you for the experiences or the behaviors that you're engaging with, so that you can learn to do the same for yourself. Because across the board, anyone who has a history of disordered eating in any direction has a lot of shame that goes with it.
Mm.
And there's a lot of self judgment that goes with it. And there's a lot of general judgment that goes with it. And I think it's really important to learn to accept, where are you and who are you? And you have value no matter what you're doing with food or
Yeah.
yourself in the world. And it's really, other people are the best way to get that as a start if you're not able to give it to yourself. And, hopefully over time you can learn to give it to yourself, which is not easy
Yeah.
um, overall at all.
I love that everything you told us is basically stuff that's free that
Yeah.
we all, but it's like we always want to have some hack, some like whatever,
Yeah.
4-hour hack, some supplement, something we have to purchase, but all those things is key for healthy aging,
Yeah.
everything you're talking about.
I will
To
offer
me,
that purchasing things is a culture specific behavior that we
Mhm.
have learned to associate with feeling better, because
You
we
mean
get gifts.
here in, I mean, what in the West?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So like the reason we want to buy things, because it's an external thing that we can trust, because we don't necessarily trust it in ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, there's something about trusting yourself that comes across as confidence. It may or may not be confidence, but it is always like, based in the sense of like, I know what I need, I know who I am, and I know what I can do. And we don't value that as a culture, particularly not in females.
Yeah.
So I think anything that gets you toward that is not what's sold to us. But if you can work toward that, which I think exercising gives you that opportunity
Hmm.
because you do actually recognize what your body can do and you see it do things that maybe it couldn't do before.
Yeah.
Sleep gives you that opportunity because sleep is really important for that prefrontal cortex, the thinking big part of your brain that tells the rest of the brain how to, like, it pulls the strings in the rest of the brain.
Uh-huh.
And it's really attentive to the outside world. If you let it be quiet for a period of time, it's sort of like a nice regeneration. And so sleep is that quiet time to some degree for reorganizing and sort of giving yourself the opportunity to figure out what's important to pay attention to for you, not for what the world is telling you. And meditation actually gives you the same thing. And whoever you choose as friends, presumably, is giving you something similar because we do tend to associate based on shared values.
Yeah.
Um, so that's it's free, accessible, and somehow not valued in our culture.
Yeah, I was thinking about even the most basic sleep, and fitness or trainers always like, oh, should get them themselves are not necessarily getting it. And for some reason in our culture, we think that sleeping or just resting is being lazy, that you're better off waking up at 4 in the morning, get your workout in versus making sure that's more important than getting whether it's 7 hours for you. That's sleep is so underrated. I don't know if it's just something in the US or of other cultures, but it just feels like the free hack that nature gave us
Yeah.
to be healthy that nobody
Yeah.
wants to believe is true.
Yeah, and sneaky, we are still to some degree evolutionarily connected to those animals that hibernate. So if you're
Mm,
feeling more tired in the wintertime, it's kind of okay to sleep a little more in the wintertime because our bodies respond to the light cycles and our bodies respond to the cycles in the year.
that
So
makes sense. I
more
mean,
rest at this time, maybe that's better.
you heard that from Dr. Ross. She said, "Go get some sleep, get some extra sleep this winter." I have a question about if there's been anything interesting
Mm.
that surprised you that you learned in your research in the lab.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, everything.
Okay,
There's so yeah, this is gonna be another hour, but let me see if I can
summarize or pick one. Because I did also have a question about future of research. Well, let me give you a choice: either that,
Mhm.
or maybe talking about something advances in neuroscience that you're excited about in terms of understanding or treating eating disorders or improving metabolic health. Let's go with that one because I
Yeah,
know the.
that's okay. I'm like, 'cause there's so many. I mean, like, I didn't even tell you about some of the other things that we study that are related to this topic that I'm
Uh-huh.
actually like so incredibly excited by, but we're like, that's not necessarily relevant to the people who are going to be listening to this. I think I'll say two things that we found in our lab right now that aren't out in the world right yet, but like we have this mouse model that is associated with obesity, and we were looking at its cognitive function, so sort of the decision making function, and we were looking at it related to food because we assumed it was going to be just about food, motivation for food,
Hmm.
because the people are overweight, and the people who have this genetic syndrome are overweight, and they have a tendency to overeat, extreme tendency to overeat. And what we're finding is in the animal model, at the very least, the same things we see in relation to food, the motivation to eat or lack of motivation, we're seeing it with water too. And so there's something about the way that these survival based circuits, these circuits that are involved in, things we need to live, they
Hmm.
are connected at a very baseline motivational level. And I think that's super interesting. And then the other thing we're studying
Could you go back to what you meant by water? You mean about even consuming water?
literally
So,
consuming water. So they have all the food they need and all the food they want. And this may be specific to the mouse because humans are able to eat without drinking. I'm not one of those humans. I need to have water if I'm eating, but mice can't because they need the water to help them with the heat production that comes up when they're eating and digesting.
Hmm.
And we have a bigger body. We don't have the same difficulty with the heat production that goes into digesting food. Um, but these mice, if we restrict their water intake, they are capable, and these are mice that are a model for a genetic syndrome of obesity, right? So if we restrict their food intake, they're able to maintain a larger body weight. But if we restrict their water intake, they also can maintain less levels of drinking. They have this storage capacity or this reduced need that makes them thrifty. It makes their bodies hold on to things, the fat, either the food, the fat, or the water hydration.
Oh,
And
that's interesting. Yeah.
exactly, right? So it's literally nothing to do with willpower, and it's nothing to do with eating, like the experience of food intake. It's everything to do with how do you how do you like how can you be efficient with the resources that you have? And so if you flip that script and you think about obesity as being incredibly efficient with storing body weight,
Mm-hmm.
or people who prefer to not drink water, who, where right now it's like a thing, you got to drink your water, and you should drink water because we need it for all the processes. But for, people who don't need to drink so much water, they have more efficiency around using water for body processes, potentially,
Yeah.
potentially. And so I think of, like, especially in neuroscience and in psychiatry, we spend a lot of time in that part of the brain making decisions, or thinking about that part of the brain making decisions. And we talked about it a lot today. But I actually think there's a lot that comes from the body that we haven't been paying a lot of attention to, that drives some of these things that we're seeing as decision making. And so that's what I'm most excited about. How can we think about studying this? Because to me, that's going to affect the stigma that goes along with eating disorders, whether overweight or restrictive.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's going to affect the way that we, I think, maybe even think about psychiatric illness. I hope that would be cool if we could change a little bit of that and pay a little of attention to what happens in the body. And I can expand on that forever too. But, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, all of these things have body findings if we look for them, but we don't.
Hmm.
We don't. We just try to manage people's behavior.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a different way of thinking about things that are affected in psychiatry. But I will, if it's okay, I'll platform for a hot minute because I know we're, like, running out of time. But, like, this week has been really hard in science and in the research world and in the health world, because there's a world of people who don't necessarily uh, either believe in or agree with the way that those of us who have been studying the processes of the body and can tolerate the complexity and have the patience to get into it, the way that we do things. And I
Let's
think,
get specific. We're talking about the current presidential administration and its view on
yeah,
science.
that's, yes, I
Yep.
was trying to be, like, incredibly nonpartisan if possible. But just to say, like, you know, I think in our conversation, it came, I brought, like, there are things that are really complex here. We don't have a handle on it. I need taxpayer money to do this work. And I do it in animal models because it's not okay to cut people's heads off and look at their brains.
Hmm.
But we can learn a lot if we do this thoughtfully. And if we do this in this way of thinking, how does this affect a human? What does this mean to the human? It may not directly give a drug. It may not directly answer the question of what is, happening in one person with anorexia nervosa, but it will get us to a point of actually, hopefully, better understanding, reducing the stigma, less blame for people and their willpower and all of this ridiculousness. Um, and we really, 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 I'm going to say we, the scientists, and we, the people in science, need people who are not in science to help us get that word across, to,
Hmm.
like, let your representatives, let your elected officials, let your government, let your current presidential administration and their incredibly under skilled folks that are being put into positions for which they're not appropriate, they need to know that like this is not okay. It's not okay on so many levels. We are not going to figure out how these things work if we can't do this work. And I really do need, regardless of people's political beliefs, for
Mhm.
people to ask their representatives to ensure the tax dollars continue to fund science, to continue to fund healthcare for people who need it, and to continue to work towards like understanding the basic foundations of what is happening in our bodies and in our brains, and
Mhm.
not to bring biases to the table of what they want the world to be.
Yeah, I love that as our final note. Uh, Dr. Ross, Dr. Rachel Ross, thank you so much for your time today. And I hope everyone who's listening learned something.
Me too.
And
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 I'm happy to follow up if there's any questions that come up that I didn't necessarily do a good job of explaining. Let me know, and I'm happy to like help you answer them. I don't know if you have a podcast where people like asking questions, but
oh, I kind of like that. I might do that. If you guys have any questions, I think on the episode you can add, there's like a commentary part, you can add questions. And then I'll put more details about Dr. Ross in the show notes. Have a wonderful week, and I hopefully you guys will join me in my Level Up Your Workouts Plyometric webinar next week.
I'm like so in. I'm so please send me those details because I'm so in. And
Have a
I'll send you my website so you have the links.
perfect. Bye, everyone.
I'm Coach Tina. For more information about how to work with me, head to ironstrongfitness.com and send me a message. I'll see you next time.